With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling cybersecurity in Spain, specifically what you need to know about the NIS 2 directive.
Ooh, sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's a big one. And to help us break it all down, we're diving into a recent episode of the Spanish radio show Cyber After Work.
Okay, I've heard of that one. They have some pretty good guests on there.
They do.
Yeah.
And this episode in particular had a legal expert who really laid out all the details. And spoiler alert, Spain's a little behind schedule.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah, the deadline to implement NIS 2 is October 17th, 2024, and they've got some catching up to do.
Okay, so Spain's behind schedule, but what does this actually mean for businesses? Best listens, NIS 2 has a way bigger scope than the old directive. It's not just about critical infrastructure anymore, right?
Exactly, and it's not just about who it applies to either. The responsibilities are way bigger, too. Like the radio show mentioned, there were stories about leaked data, cyber attacks. Even Pokemon wasn't safe.
Pokemon? Wait, seriously?
Yeah, for real. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but it shows that no one is immune to these threats.
That's a good point. So maybe we should start with the basics. What exactly is NIS 2?
Good idea. It's an EU directive that aims to boost cybersecurity across all the member states. And while it builds on the existing NIS 1 framework, there are some major changes.
Like what?
Well, for starters, who it applies to, it's not just those essential entities anymore, like energy and transport. Now it includes important entities, which means way more businesses based on their size and what sector they're in.
So like a small business might suddenly fall under NIS 2 even if they didn't before.
It's definitely something to check out. And then there's the whole issue of responsibility.
Okay, what about it?
Well, now company leaders like board members and executives have direct responsibility.
Oh, wow. So if they mess up on cybersecurity, they're on the hook personally.
Exactly. If they drop the ball, they could be held personally liable.
That's huge. I bet that makes it harder to find people willing to serve on boards knowing they have this added risk.
That's a valid point. But it also shows how seriously cybersecurity is being taken these days. It's not just an IT problem anymore. It's a whole company problem.
Makes sense. So what else is different with NIS 2?
Well, there's also a much bigger emphasis on information sharing.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Basically, if there's a cybersecurity incident, companies have to be way more transparent. They need to be ready to work with authorities and even each other to share information about what happened.
More transparency. I can already hear some businesses groaning about that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But think of it this way. The more we share information about threats and vulnerabilities, the better equipped we all are to defend against them. It's like a collective defense system.
Okay, I get that. But still, it's a big change for a lot of companies, especially those who are used to keeping their security practices close to the vest.
It is a big change. But maybe this delay in Spain is actually a good thing in disguise. It gives businesses a bit more time to prepare. You know, like when online tax filing first came out, everyone was hesitant and confused, but now it's just part of life.
True. So how can companies use this extra time to get ready for NIS 2? What should they be focusing on?
Well, first off, they need to figure out if they're even covered by the directive. There are resources available to help with that. And then they need to start putting those technical and organizational measures in place. You know, like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, data encryption, that sort of thing.
Okay, so it's not just about having the technology, it's also about having the right policies and procedures in place.
Exactly, and training. Don't forget about training. Especially for those board members and executives, they need to know the risks and what's expected of them.
Right, no more burying their heads in the sand. And what about things like ISO 27001 or the National Security Scheme? The expert on Cyber After Work mentioned those.
Yeah, those are cybersecurity frameworks and certifications. Having them could definitely help demonstrate compliance. It's like having a seal of approval saying, hey, we take cybersecurity seriously.
Makes sense. But what about smaller companies? It seems like a lot to ask, especially if they don't have the same resources as the big guys.
That's a good point. And it's something that the radio show brought up too. SMEs definitely face unique challenges. Cybersecurity can feel like a luxury when you're just trying to keep the lights on.
So what can they do?
Well, the first step is recognizing that cybersecurity is no longer optional, especially if they're in strategically important sectors like healthcare or transport. They need to prioritize this, even if it's tough.
Easier said than done, though, right? Especially when you're dealing with limited budgets and staff.
For sure. Yeah, but there are ways to make it work. One thing the experts suggested was bringing in outside help. Think of it like hiring a contractor to renovate your house.
Yeah.
You might be handy, but sometimes you need a specialist.
So it's like a cybersecurity consultant could come in and help them figure out what needs to be done.
Exactly. They can help with risk assessment, setting up the right measures, figuring out the internal governance, all that stuff.
Okay, so call in the pros. But besides avoiding those hefty fines, what's the real motivation for these smaller businesses to comply?
Well, increasingly, those larger clients are going to demand it as part of their own supply chain security.
Yeah.
They want to make sure that everyone they're working with is up to snuff.
So it becomes a matter of staying competitive and keeping those contracts.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of data breaches and the dark web.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's something that really hit home for me when I heard those stories on the radio show.
Yeah, those were pretty scary. Like the one about leaked data from Spanish politicians ending up on the dark web. That's definitely a wake-up call.
It is, and it shows that this stuff is real and it can have serious consequences for everyone, not just big companies.
Okay, so let's break this down. What are the risks of data breaches, and how do they impact individuals and organizations?
Well, for starters, a data breach can lead to identity theft, financial losses, reputational damage, you name it. And it's not just a one-time problem either. Once your data is out there, it can be used and sold over and over again.
Yikes. The radio show mentioned a case with a Barcelona hospital where patient data is still publicly available after a ransomware attack. That's terrifying.
It is. And it shows how vulnerable we all are, even institutions that we trust with our most sensitive information.
So what happens to that stolen data? Where does it go?
Well, a lot of it ends up on the dark web, which is basically a digital black market where criminals buy and sell stolen data. It's like the Wild West of the internet.
And once it's there, there's no getting it back right.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's why data loss prevention DLP is so important. It's about putting measures in place to make sure that sensitive information doesn't leak out in the first place.
Like what kinds of measures?
Well, things like encryption access, controls data backups. And it's also about having clear policies and procedures in place for handling data throughout its life cycle.
Makes sense. So it's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Exactly. And one of the stories that really drove that point home for me was the one about Internet Archive.
The nonprofit digital library. What happened to them?
They got hit with 3 cyberattacks in just 1 month.
3? Wow. How is that even possible?
Well, it highlights the importance of supply chain security. You know, even if you have top-notch security yourself, if your partners don't, you're still at risk.
So it's like a chain reaction, one weak link, and the whole system can collapse.
Exactly. And that's why NIS 2 puts so much emphasis on supply chain security. You need to make sure that everyone in your network is taking cybersecurity seriously.
That makes a lot of sense.
No.
But how do you actually go about doing that? It seems like a huge undertaking.
It can be.
Yeah.
But there are tools and resources available to help. One thing that companies can do is implement vendor risk management programs.
Okay, so what does that involve?
Basically, it's about assessing the security posture of your vendors before you do business with them. You want to make sure that they have the right security controls in place and that they're meeting your standards.
So it's like a background check for your vendors.
Pretty much. And it's a crucial part of protecting your own organization from supply chain attacks.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this ties together. But before we move on, I have to ask about the Pokemon story. You mentioned that even they got hit. What happened there?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. The Game Freak breach. They're the company that develops Pokemon, and they had personal data stolen from over 2,400 current and former employees.
Wow. So even a huge company like that isn't immune to these attacks.
Nope, no one is. And it's a good reminder that cybersecurity is something that we all need to be thinking about, no matter how big or small our organizations are.
Okay, so what happened in the Game Freak attack?
Well, they had addresses, emails, all sorts of personal information stolen. And on top of that, they also lost confidential business data, like details about future games and consoles.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just personal info, it was sensitive business data, too.
Exactly. And that shows the potential financial and reputational damage that these breaches can cause.
Yeah, no kidding. So how does all of this tie into getting ready for NIS 2?
Well, for one thing, it highlights the need for strong data loss prevention measures.
Right, we were talking about DLP earlier.
Exactly. It's about making sure that sensitive information doesn't leave the company without permission. And that includes everything from encrypting data to implementing access controls to having clear policies and procedures in place.
So it's a multi-layered approach.
It is. And it's something that every organization needs to be thinking about if they want to comply with NIS2 and protect themselves from the growing threat of cyber attacks.
Makes sense. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps for businesses in Spain?
Well, the first step is to really understand what NIS2 requires of them. And that means diving into the details of the directive and figuring out what applies to their specific situation.
Okay, and then what?
Then it's about assessing their current security posture. What systems do they have in place? What are their vulnerabilities? And how can they improve their security to meet the requirements of NIS2?
Sounds like a pretty big undertaking, especially for those companies that are starting from scratch.
It can be. But there are resources available to help, like the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, Enise. They have a ton of guidance documents and tools that can help businesses get started.
So there's help out there if you know where to look.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out to experts for guidance either. There are a lot of cybersecurity consultants who can help businesses navigate the complexities of NIS2.
Okay, so it's about getting informed, getting prepared, and getting protected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, feels like these data breaches are a flashing neon sign saying, get your cybersecurity act together. So if I'm hearing you right, getting NIS2 compliant isn't just about checking boxes. It's about really understanding the risks and putting those safeguards in place.
Exactly. It's a shift in mindset, from just reacting to threats to actively preventing them. And it's not just about protecting data either. It's also about protecting the essential services that rely on that data. Think about healthcare, energy, transportation. A disruption in those systems could have a major impact on people's lives.
Okay, so the stakes are high. But for those of us who aren't cybersecurity experts, what are some concrete things we can do to get ready for NIS2?
Well, first you need to figure out if you even fall under the scope of the directive. There are resources available to help you determine that. Then it's about assessing your current security posture. What systems do you have in place? What are your vulnerabilities?
But how do you even know what your vulnerabilities are? That seems like something you'd need an expert for.
You're right. Getting an external audit can be very helpful. But even before that, you can start by looking at things like your data handling practices. Are you encrypting sensitive information? Do you have access controls in place? Are you regularly backing up your data?
Ooh, backups. That's a good one. I learned that the hard way when my old laptop crashed and I lost a bunch of files. Not fun.
It's one of those things that's easy to put off until it's too late, but having a solid backup strategy is essential.
Yeah.
Especially with the rise of ransomware attacks.
Speaking of ransomware, that's a whole other can of worms. Is that something NIS2 specifically addresses?
Yes. NIS2 requires organizations to implement measures to prevent and respond to ransomware attacks. This includes things like having up-to-date security software, multi-factor authentication, and incident response plans.
Okay, so it's a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the basics for a minute. For those of us who aren't tech wizards, what are some simple things we can do to improve our cybersecurity, even if it's just on a personal level?
Well, one of the most important things is to be password savvy. Use strong, unique passwords for every account. And consider a password manager to keep track of them. And enable two-factor authentication whenever possible.
I know. It's a hassle sometimes. But it's like that extra layer of security on your front door. It might be inconvenient, but it's worth it for the peace of mind.
Exactly. And be wary of phishing emails. Don't click on suspicious links or open attachments from unknown senders. If something seems fishy, double-check with the organization directly.
So it's about being a little bit paranoid. Trust, but verify.
Exactly. And keep your software up to date. Those updates might seem annoying, but they often contain important security patches.
It's like getting a flu shot for your computer.
I like that analogy. And finally, be mindful of what information you share online. The more you put out there, the more you're at risk.
So think before you post, especially those vacation photos. No need to advertise that your house is empty.
Good point. It's all about being aware of the risks and taking those small steps that can make a big difference.
It feels like with cybersecurity, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You can't just do one thing and think you're covered. It's a constant process.
Absolutely. And it's something that needs to be embraced by everyone, from individuals to businesses to governments. We all have a role to play in creating a safer and more secure digital world.
Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why of NIS2. But let's get practical. For those businesses scrambling to get compliant, what are some key steps they should be taking right now?
Well, the first step is to understand what NIS2 actually requires of them. This means diving into the details of the directive and figuring out what applies to their specific situation. There are resources available to help with this, including guidance documents from the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, Enise.
So don't just assume you know what you need to do your homework.
Right. Once you have a clear understanding of the requirements, the next step is to conduct a thorough risk assessment. This involves identifying your critical assets and systems, evaluating the threats and vulnerabilities they face, and determining the potential impact of a security incident.
So it's like a security checkup for your business.
Yeah.
You need to know where you're vulnerable before you can fix it.
Exactly. And this assessment should be a regular process, not just a one-time thing. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so you need to stay on top of it.
So it's not just about getting compliant once and then forgetting about it.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process.
Right. Once you've identified your risks, you can start developing and implementing your security measures. This is where things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and data encryption come in. And it's also about having those policies and procedures in place, things like password management, data backup, and incident response.
Okay, so it's a combination of technology and good old-fashioned planning.
Exactly. And don't forget about training your employees. They're often the first line of defense, so they need to be aware of the risks and how to protect themselves and the organization.
It's like that saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So you can have all the fancy technology in the world, but if your employees are clicking on phishing links, it's all for nothing.
Very true. And remember, NIS 2 also emphasizes supply chain security. You need to be sure that your partners and suppliers are also taking cybersecurity seriously.
This is not just about your own house. It's about the whole neighborhood.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to seek help. There are many resources available to businesses, including government agencies, industry associations, and cybersecurity consultants.
Right.
Don't try to go it alone.
So find your tribe and learn from each other. It makes sense. But what about those companies who are really struggling, especially those smaller businesses with limited budgets? Are there any shortcuts or easier ways to get compliant?
Well, there's no magic bullet, but there are ways to prioritize and make the most of your resources. Focus on the most critical assets and systems first, and implement the most impactful security measures.
So it's about working smarter, not harder.
Right. And remember, even small steps can make a big difference. Start with the basics like strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and software updates. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
That's good advice for life in general, not just cybersecurity. So we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap up, is there anything else businesses in Spain should be thinking about as this NIS 2 deadline approaches?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that compliance is an ongoing process. It's not just about meeting the requirements once and then forgetting about it. You need to be constantly monitoring and adapting your security posture to keep up with the ever-changing threat landscape.
So like a treadmill. You gotta keep running to stay in place.
Exactly. And the other thing to remember is that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the IT department's problem. Everyone in the organization needs to be aware of the risks and take those small steps to protect themselves and the company.
So it's a team effort. Everyone's got to be on board.
Absolutely. And by working together, we can create a more secure and resilient digital environment for everyone.
Okay, that's a great message to end on. So for our listeners who are just tuning in or need a quick recap, what are the key takeaways they should walk away with today?
Well, first and foremost, cybersecurity is no longer optional. It's essential for any business operating in today's digital world.
So don't wait for a breach to happen before you take action.
Right. And NIS 2 is a big deal, especially for businesses in Spain. It's not just about protecting data. It's about protecting essential services and ensuring the smooth functioning of our society.
It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. And even small steps can make a big difference. Start with the basics, strong passwords, two-factor authentication software updates, and don't be afraid to seek help from experts.
So get informed, get prepared, and get protected.
Yay! Great advice. Phew. Feels like we've really given everyone a lot to think about today. But hey, that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Giving you the knowledge to navigate this crazy digital world. It's not getting any simpler out there.
No kidding. And with NIS 2 coming up, it's more important than ever for businesses to be prepared.
Speaking of NIS 2, as we wrap up this deep dive, I always like to ask, what's that one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder, even after they've hit that stop button.
That's a good question. I think for me, the most important thing is to remember that cybersecurity isn't just about technology, it's about people.
Oh, I like that. So it's not just firewalls and passwords. It's about us, our choices, our awareness, our behaviors. Exactly. And because of that human element, it's critical that everyone's involved, not just the IT folks. From the top to the bottom, we're all part of creating a more secure online world. We all have a role to play.
It takes a village, something like that.
Exactly. And the more we all learn about the risks and what we can do to protect ourselves, the better off we'll all be.
Well said. Knowledge is power. Right. Well, on that note, a huge thanks to our expert for leading us through this deep dive. This has been eye-opening.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there. The internet's a wild place.
Couldn't agree more. And until next time, keep diving deeper.
At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 300 programs at asuonline.asu.edu.